and all the elements that are associated with the shipping vector of introduction, as well as managing trade, so aquarium trade and bait fish and aquaculture, to come together and think about how to help prevent unintentional introduction and dispersal, to coordinate federally conducted, funded, and authorized research, so putting some resources into thinking about how to manage these species and prevent their introduction. And also to work with the states through the development of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, which involves the 13 federal agencies that have a role at some part in this activity, but as well as state players, non-governmental players, and the private sector. It's coming together to think about how the different management activities that could occur at different levels. In the Great Lakes, there's actually a Great Lakes panel on aquatic nuisance species that brings the 8 states together with the federal agencies and several NGOs to think about it. There's also a National Invasive Species Council. So the first one, Aquatic Nuisance Species, focused just on aquatic species. The Invasives Council recognizes that invasives are terrestrial and aquatic and coordinates on that level as well. So that's what's happening at the federal level. Unfortunately, our last legislation, the National Invasive Species Act, expired in about 2002, and it's been very challenging to come together and think about what the next version of that legislation should be. What should be in it, what authorities should be in it, who should be given specific management authorities, should any agency get to be sort of the boss. How do we relate, how does the federal government relate with the states? There's lots of questions and they haven't been answered. So that's been a big challenge. At the regional response, I mentioned the Great Lakes panel on aquatic nuisance species. It dates from 1991 with the introduction of the first invasive species legislation at the national level. And it's facilitated by the Great Lakes Commission, and it helps identify Great Lakes priorities and make recommendations to the National Task Force. So it's like the regional coordinator back up to the national level, hopefully influencing federal activities and federal resources to impact the issue. There's also a no-bob requirement. No-bob refers to ships coming into the region that actually have cargo on them. So I mentioned ballast water was a challenge. A lot of the ballast water issues have been addressed by having ships with ballast on board exchange their ballast out in the ocean. In the salt water, they wash out their ballast tanks with salt water that effectively kills any freshwater species, and then they can come into a freshwater system. The problem we found out is that there are a class of vessels out there that don't come into the system with ballast. They come in loaded with cargo. And this is a sort of a diagram demonstrating what happens. They come in, they might come into, say, Toledo, and offload some cargo there. So they're a little bit lighter and they're sort of out of ballast. So they take on freshwater ballast in Toledo and head up to Duluth. Well, between Toledo and Duluth, the species that are in their tanks, either in some resting form or some sort of hibernating stage, all of a sudden they've got fresh water, they're happy creatures, and they hatch. And they get sort of let out when they take on cargo. So they offload their cargo and take on more cargo, they get rid of their ballast, and they leave whatever is in their tanks behind. Those are no ballast on board or no-bob ships. So they come into the region, they declare they're no-bob, they don't have to do a high seas exchange, but we found out that they are actually responsible for introducing some of the later species that I had mentioned earlier. And so there's, since relatively recently, like the early 2000s, there's been a set of no-bob best management practices, and working with the vessel captains to make sure that they're doing some residual rinsing if they can in the high seas. It all really depends what the weather's like. And also there's been coordination between the US and Canadian Coast Guards, so that if there's not a US presence to do an inspection, the Canadians can cover. So they're basically covering everyone's covering for everybody else, just to make sure that we're doing the inspections that need to be done, to make sure that the captains are doing what they say they're doing coming into the region. What challenges remain? So I think one of the biggest challenges is in harmonizing approaches. And I put state approaches because you probably are all most sort of thinking about what's happening at the state level and the state ballast water requirements. But I mentioned earlier that this is an international issue, and the International Maritime Organization, which is part of the United Nations, has been dealing with ballast slowly because they can only move as fast as their slowest members, as with anything that happens at the international level. But nonetheless, that's definitely the area where you are going to have the biggest impact if everyone can sign on to, there's actually a ballast water convention, if we can get it signed on to by enough countries to come into effect, that will dramatically impact the no-bobs and the other ballast issues that we're dealing with. And it's not just us. You know, other freshwater systems and brackish, like estuarine systems, where the ports tend to be located at the mouth of big rivers, are facing similar invasive species issue. So it's not just that we're very excited about it. Other parts of the world are also. The challenge is all that economic stuff I mentioned earlier, and having people really understand the bottom line economic impact that's not the short-term economic impact of sort of interfering with their business and trade, but the longer-term economic impact of ecosystem integrity and what that means. So I had mentioned harmonizing state approaches, and I think one of the biggest challenges is when you're a state legislator or even a federal legislator, and your constituents are talking to you and saying, we have this problem, we've got zebra mussels, do something about it. We can't catch fish anymore off our dock, we can't go out and catch fish. We used to be able to catch our limit of kings, you know, in 2 hours, and we can't catch anything. And this is a problem that's related to ballast water, so do something about it. And it's hard not to respond to your constituents, obviously. And it's hard to say it's not our responsibility, because of course the state has responsibility for resources, natural resources. It's hard to say it's the federal's job to do something because that's maybe the most effective area for something to happen. But the reality is that the states should be doing something, but doing it in concert. So all the states have similar, uniform, if possible, approaches, so they're not, again, impacting all the other pieces that you could be impacting. So I've heard that the Michigan approach, the Michigan ballast legislation, is viewed as being very rigid, very strong, which is good. That's what we want, except it also means that some ships are bypassing our ports and offloading in Toledo and shipping it up by truck or doing something else, unintended consequence. So having a common approach in the Great Lakes where we all have the same ballast regulations would mean that that there's no state or other port that has an unfair advantage. And that's just one example of the kinds of things that would benefit from the harmonization of regional approach, at least, and then bringing pressure on the feds and then through them on the international community to make sure we really tackle the issue where it's most, I guess, effective to do so. So I did say I talk about Asian carp. So Asian carp obviously have been making the headlines. You've probably all seen the videos where the guys are driving their boats and they're flying out of the water, and obviously that's a huge sort of immediate tier 1 impact, right? I mean, if you get hit in the head with a carp, you know, it's actually caused a couple of fatalities. That's not a good thing. And then, you know, this guy over here got hit, and he says he's not going to get hit again. He got hit once, never again. Asian carp, so that's a collective term we apply to, there's multiple species, silver, big head, black carp, there's a variety of them, and they were brought in the 1970s, so they're from Asia, as the name implies, and they were brought over in the 1970s to improve water quality in aquaculture ponds and water treatment facilities, primarily in the south. We believe that they entered the Mississippi River system sometime in the 90s, there were several years where there were some big flooding years in the 90s, and the ponds that they were in were breached, and the fish were able to escape. Makes it sound like they were prisoners, but anyway, they got out and they did their fish thing, and they're very fertile fish. And the Mississippi River happens to be well suited. That system happens to be well suited to their habitat needs for spawning and reproducing. And so they've been very, aggressive gives them a sort of personifies them or anthropomorphizes them. I don't think they're in their heads being aggressive. They're just spreading out, and they're spreading upstream. And as they approach the Great Lakes, they're spreading up into the Upper Illinois River system, and which is now connected to Lake Michigan, because we were dealing with some earlier issues. So again, how intertwined are we? All these challenges. Turn of the last century, cholera and typhoid problems in Chicago meant that we reversed the flow of the Chicago River, and instead of flowing into Lake Michigan and bringing all the waste and sewage and everything out to the water intake, we were able to sweep it down the Illinois River into the Mississippi and not worry about it. At the same time, we made a good connection between the Mississippi and the Great Lakes for transportation, for barge traffic, and the economy really appreciated that. So now we have this very complicated situation where we have this connection. It's not a natural connection, it's something we did, that is a potential vector, one of the potential vectors for these species to come into the Great Lakes. And it's being studied quite a lot. There are several task forces, it's happening. There's court cases. I mean, some of you know more about the very specifics of the individual elements than I do. I do know that everybody wants something done about it, and they want it done now. But the reality is the decisions that were made that led to this sort of impending invasion were big decisions. And to reverse them, we have to think very carefully about what's the best approach. And we also have to think about the resource it would take to, say, close down the Chicago sanitary and shipping canal and compare that to the other vectors where those fish could enter the system. So for example, there's the Upper Illinois and the Maumee watershed connect at a very low place that periodically floods. I mean, they could just swim right across there. They've put a fence across, so the fence will keep them out. Oh, but the fence has holes in it about this big. They could be introduced unintentionally through bait fish, because the little carp look like shad and minnows, and they look like really good fish, and they can get scooped up unintentionally, and there they could get introduced that way. So it's not as simple. The solution to this challenge that we have isn't simple as with all of them, and this is sort of one set of species. If they get into the system, we think they could have a pretty big impact, maybe not on the open lakes themselves, but into the tributaries. And they eat at the bottom level of the food web, so they'd be eating up whatever's left. And that could potentially have a huge impact on the rest of our sort of fragile ecosystem. So with that happy thought, I'd be happy to take any questions related to the presentation. It was kind of a whirlwind tour through the history and some of the impacts of invasive species. Yes, sir.
Are any scientists working on any kind of technique to handle, say, mussels, or to interrupt their reproduction or anything like that?
Right, so the question was whether there are scientists working on techniques to, in essence, manage invasive species. And there is lots of research ongoing into things like pheromones that attract species, and figuring out how, if you release pheromones at a certain time of the year, spring of the year, when they're thinking about spawning, you can attract them and maybe capture enough of the adults that you could limit their reproduction. I have seen some research about a year ago on a zebra mussel side, some kind of a chemical that they think could affect zebra mussel veligers. The challenge there, of course, is that they're so pervasive, and thinking about adding that kind of chemical to everywhere would be a huge challenge. So that would be sort of a spot treatment for infrastructure and that kind of thing. But there's